Esther 5 and 6 this morning, so I'm going to try to cover 2 chapters. The Swensons they texted me and let me know they aren't going to be here with us this morning. They're usually here, but they're actually up with Ray and Marissa this morning, so they're out. They, I think, went up with Mrs. Wadsworth and everything, so they're going to go visit. Hear Ray preach and see them, so that's nice for them, but anyway, so they can get the recording. But anyway, so we're in Esther 5. Esther 4, we had talked about last week, was the realization, the reaction to this coming genocide, this ethnic cleansing that's going to happen to the Jews that's been decreed throughout the land by Xerxes. But the real person behind it is Haman, because of his hatred for Mordecai individually, but he also wants to totally annihilate the Jews. And then Mordecai goes to Esther as the kind of last hope to try to go to the king illegally, to approach him uninvited in the throne room in order to ask for mercy, to intercede on behalf of the people. And so Esther's identity is still hidden from the king, from Haman. A lot of people don't really know she's a Jew, a worshiper of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so this has come together. And so she's hesitant at first, somewhat understandably. She's hesitant to go before the king because she could die. There's this fear of assassins coming in, and there were assassins earlier in Esther 2. There was an attempt to kill the king, so anybody who came in acting unusually or uninvited into the throne room, didn't matter who they were, they could be executed on the spot according to the law if they were seen to be acting in some way that was unusual. And so Mordecai tells her, you have to go to the king. He goes, this is your time. He goes, who knows if you might have become attained royalty, become queen for such a time as this, in Esther 4:14. So he leads her to the conclusion with a question, and he really presents before her, look, you're not going to escape either. If the reality is, if Haman's plot unfolds the way it's decreed to unfold by the king, you're going to die too. You're not going to be exempt. You have no special immunity. So would you rather die trying to help and save your people, or would you rather die later, having done nothing? And so Esther concludes in Esther 4:16 with that kind of resolution that if I perish, I perish. If she has to kind of resolve herself to the worst possible thing, that if I'm going to die, that's what's going to happen. And sometimes before we make a decision that's hard, we have to think, okay, well, what's the worst possible cost that can happen here, and then resolve ourselves to that and say, okay, well, if that's going to happen, then that's what we have to do. It's interesting. We're starting in college and career group. We're starting our study in Daniel, which precedes Esther in just before it in history and in the kind of Old Testament Jewish canon. And it's just interesting seeing the kind of comparison and contrast between Daniel and his friends, Esther and Mordecai. And these are all important people. These are all people God used. They're all believers in the Lord. But just the differences in Daniel, 1:8, talks about that Daniel, and his friends, he set up his mind beforehand to honor the Lord, not defile himself with the king's food, that he was going to worship the Lord, not compromise. And so he had to, do that with forethought. Esther, because of Mordecai's instructions, she doesn't make known her Jewish kindred. Mordecai tells her not to. And certainly they had their reasons for doing that. It's a little bit morally, ambiguous. It doesn't speak to, okay, this was right or this was wrong or whatever the case may be. But what I was kind of realizing is, well, you can do that, but it kind of becomes only a matter of time at that point, because it's eventually going to be revealed. Now, of course, God uses both. God uses Daniel. God uses Esther. I think the preference would be to be a Daniel, if we have to follow an example, but I can kind of understand Esther and Mordecai's position that they took as well. But it can only, it's only a matter of time that they can conceal that identity. And now Esther is going to have to reveal it to the king. And so we're going to get into chapter 5 and 6 today where we see, what happens. It seems this impossible situation where there's going to be this pogrom. There's going to be this killing of the Jews. Esther's not supposed to approach the king. She hasn't been summoned for over a month. And so she doesn't know if she's lost favor with him or not. So let's look at the throne room in verses in chapter 5, verses really 1 through 8, but I'll start with 1 through 4. Verse 1 here says, "Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's place in front of the king's rooms," or royal house. "And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace." So Esther comes in. So notice the 3 days there. Remember that at the end of Esther 4, she had told Mordecai, "Go tell the Jews of Persia to fast for me." And she doesn't, the author purposely intentionally leaves out prayer, even though fasting is always, for Jews, is always tied with prayer. Go fast for me, and go. So they had been praying to the Lord for 3 days, but the author is leaving that detail out in order that the providence of God is going to be highlighted. That even though God is hidden in name, in specific acts that are attributed to God, it becomes so obvious that God is the one working together these details. But that's what the author is trying to focus on. Daniel 9:3, Daniel did something similar. He fasted and prayed. And so this is what was going on. So at the end of that 3 days, Esther finally enters the throne room. She puts on her royal robes and comes into the room opposite the king. The king is there on the throne. And you could imagine the pressure of, what it's like to walk into a room where it's, you're not supposed to be there. Or it's unexpected there. Maybe you've walked into like a wrong classroom in college or school or something, or just some awkward thing has happened that's drawn attention to yourself, or what in a strange way. And so there's that, but also what she's doing is not according to the law. She's not committing a crime necessarily, but she's there in a way that is noticeable, that is everyone knows is not supposed to happen. It's not according to convention. And so she's entered there, and the king is across the palace. So, she certainly knows the people of the royal court in the throne room, but the guy that she wants to talk to is across the room. And so, she's trying to approach the king. And so this is a potentially dangerous situation for her, because she could, again, as I said, be executed on the spot. But let me read verses 2 through 4. It says, "When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, 'What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even to half my kingdom, and it shall be given to you.' Esther said, 'If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him.'" So let's pause there. So Esther survives. The king sees her again. She is not fallen out of the king's graces. It says in Esther 2, it's been a few years since they've been married. But in Esther 2:17, she gets his favor. He falls in love with Esther. He loves her more than all the other women. Chooses her. They've been married for a few years, and he sees her, at this time, and hasn't interacted with her for a while, but he sees her again and obtains. She obtains that favor with him, and the custom here, the king extends his scepter. That's the sign that he is accepted her presence, that she is not a threat. So, I don't know how much time elapsed during that, whether it was 30 seconds or if it felt really long, or if the people were, really unsure of what to do in that situation, whether the guards were thinking they should take some sort of action, or whether it was more just calm and relaxed. But he extends that scepter, and she, touches it, and shows that she's been allowed. And so he notices something is wrong with her. And he asks her, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I'm fine." No, I'm just kidding. So he asks her, "What's troubling you?" So he can see, obviously she's had the pressure of this day approaching, and thinking that, this could be the end of her life. Not only that, if it is not the end of her life, she's having to reveal that her people are the ones that the king's decree is going to execute on this chosen day. And the law of the Medes and the Persians can't be reversed. So, what do you even ask for? You can't change the law. So anyway, she has to ask this. And so he asks her, "What's troubling you?" He exaggerates a little bit. This is common in King's ancient Near East. Herod did this with in Mark 6. He says, "Okay, I'll give you anything you ask, anything even up to half my kingdom." And then the woman says, "I want the head of John the Baptist." And he's like, "Oh, I wish he hadn't asked for wish he hadn't asked for that." But this is common. So he's offering her whatever she wants, basically. And Esther, I don't know if she hesitated or if she planned to extend out what she was really asking for. Either way, sometimes we plan to have a conversation with someone, and you get really psyched up for it and worked up for it and plan to have it at a certain time, and there's just something doesn't work out, or you lose your nerve, or you hesitate, or you don't say all that you meant to say, and then you have to extend it out and have the conversation later. Or maybe she planned this. But either way, this is going to be hugely decisive, that she doesn't ask him at that time in the royal court she doesn't intercede for her people at that moment. And we could have said, okay, well, she compromised, she lost her nerve, but this is going to be instrumental, as we're going to see in this chapter, how this unfolds. Because of the divine providence of God, Esther found favor with the king. So behind this are the inner workings of the secret, unknown hand of God in these ordinary circumstances, through ordinary means, to produce the results that are according to God's sovereign will. Let me read kind of a cross-reference here. Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart," and speaking of any king, "the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes." And so this speaks of kind of a superlative. It takes it to the highest ranking person, a king. And it says that even the king, the highest person, who there's no one earthly above this individual in terms of authority, we may think this person can totally do their own will. They can be totally autonomous. They can totally work out whatever their plans are independently, that they're still not independent from God. That the king's heart is like channels in the hand of the Lord. And this is a reference likely to ancient Near Eastern farming techniques that redirected water and irrigation. Just like water's moving, like water's in the hand of the Lord, it redirected water in certain directions. Now the water's flowing. I mean, that's what water does. When it meets gravity, flows downhill. But the water's being moved and directed, kind of like our aqueduct out here. It directs all that water. And it says that that's like the king's heart. And if that's the highest person in our minds, our estimation, that applies to everybody else as well, that the Lord can king's heart wherever he wishes. He can direct people's hearts. And as we're going to see, he does that even with his enemies. He does it even with Haman. And Haman would not say that he was being directed by the God of Israel in his decisions. Haman would say he's doing whatever he wants. But in doing whatever he wants, he's really doing what God ultimately wants. And so we see here that nothing's outside the sovereign control and direction of God, that God may and does direct all people, even the obstinate and opposed to God, are being directed toward God's purposes. And so God used the king's love for Esther to move forward his plan for his people in history. Let me read verses 5 through 8 here, and we'll continue. It says, "Then the king said, 'Bring Haman quickly, and may we do as Esther desires,'" or do according to the word of Esther. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So they come to the banquet that night, or that very day, same time period. And as they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom, and it shall be done." Okay, so the king and Haman both come, and now she has them both alone in a room together. And we think, okay, this is the perfect chance. Okay, you maybe it was wise to take this conversation out of the throne room and the royal court and have it with the king and Haman alone. Okay, this might be the good place to have that confrontation of Haman in front of the king. So she brings them there. They come, and the king repeats his affirmation to Esther's request. Whatever it is, I'll give it to you. And Haman's feeling really good too, because he thinks, I'm the only person who's been invited to this private dinner with the king and queen. And so he's, feeling really good. So again, let's look at verse 7. So Esther replied, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So it's, we kind of it's like this tension build up, okay, she's going to ask for it. She's going to tell him about, who she is. She's going to say, let him draw the conclusion about Haman and what's going on here. And she doesn't do it. And the text doesn't explain why. Again, maybe she had this plan laid out that was a little bit more elaborate. Maybe she backed down and decided, okay, I'm not going to do this at this moment for whatever reason. The reason ultimately doesn't matter. What's important is that God is still working in her not asking right then and there. Because there's still some other things, there's still some other details that are going to unfold that, had she asked, the story wouldn't have worked out the same way, as we'll see. So she doesn't make her request there. Let me read a quote. It says, "The delay proves to be decisive for the outcome of the story, confirming the Lord's providence in all that happens." There have been times, and it's somewhat right to feel this way. Sometimes we do compromise on the time where it's the right thing to say something at the right time when it is needed. And, I've not done that sometimes. I've been like, oh, man. And I come back and maybe do it later. But ultimately, and it's not that I'm absolved or that any of us are absolved in responsibility for not doing the right thing at the right time, but that the Lord still works within that the Lord is still directing ultimately all those circumstances in an unknown way. It's a way that we don't understand how he's doing it. And sometimes we get glimpses. We can look back and say, okay, this is how the Lord was working all those details together. But as this chapter unfolds, you're going to see Esther's very humorous. It's funny. It's going to, hopefully can tease that out a little bit. But it's that the sovereignty of God, the providence of God, and we've experienced this, I'm certain, is that sometimes when God works things together in such a specific way, and just such a perfect way. It's like so overwhelming that it's just, you almost have to laugh at it. It's just humorous to see that how, well, that was, unexpected, but perfect. God worked every single detail together of everything that, I could not have anticipated or expected or planned. And it works out perfectly, and it always works out perfectly because the Lord's the one behind it. And this is how it's going to unfold in the story of Esther as well. But let's move on to the next point here and see Haman's dissatisfaction or Haman's pride in verses 9 through 14. I'm going to break this down a little bit. Let's read verse 9. It says, "Then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart." So he's excited because he's been at this private dinner with the royals. It says, "But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai." So he was going out in a good mood. He had everything going for him. Haman's the second in command of this kingdom. He's been promoted to this position of authority. Haman basically has the royal throne. He has the ear of the king. He's an advisor to the king. The king listens to him and makes decrees that Haman suggests. He's now had this personal invite from the queen to have dinner. Now, we know, this is kind of the fun thing in some literature. Literature or movies sometimes put the reader or the viewer or the hearer in what's called the third person omniscient. I guess omnipresent too. But third person omniscient, which means we see the whole story that not all the characters see at the time. So it's like mystery movies do this a lot of the times. Or romance movies do this a lot of the time, where we know the full picture, but we know that the characters don't all know it yet. So we know that this is not good for Haman. Like, we know that Haman doesn't know who Esther is, doesn't know her relation to Mordecai. So he thinks this is all good news. So he's really excited. But one thing that robs him of his joy, that does not allow him to move on, is his hatred for Mordecai. No matter what he seems to have, he cannot get over the fact that no matter how powerful he seems to be, that this Benjamite, Mordecai the Jew, will not bow down before him, will not even genuflect, will not tremble before him. Won't, and even there's the word here for tremble before means pretty much to stand out of the way. Unfortunately, in the United States, probably in other places in the world, because of the legacy of a lot of racism and slavery, it was the pattern of blacks to have to step out off of the sidewalk, in certain places, for whites to pass by, and you had to call them sir and stuff like that. That's kind of the thing that's going on here, except Mordecai doesn't do it. And so, he's supposed to kind of stand aside for him or stand up when he comes in a room and stuff like that. That kind of attitude is here. And Mordecai refuses to do that. And so he doesn't stand, and that angers Haman to such a degree. He already hates Mordecai. And he hates Mordecai even more because he's a Benjamite and Mordecai's an Agagite. They have this ancient tribal rivalry where Saul's Benjamite tribe, Saul was supposed to kill all the Amalekites, all the Agagites that were represented by Agag, their king. Numbers, we'll read some passages later, talked about the prophetic future of Agag, of Amalek, in relation to Israel. And now Israel's in exile. And there's this, Mordecai the Jew, who's a Benjamite. And so now Haman wants to illustrate in this Benjamite Jew, Mordecai, bowing before him, that history's been reversed. And now Agag, now my tribe, is really over you. And so he cannot get over the fact. He could have just, in a sense, left it alone and just been like, okay, well, it's, just Mordecai. I hate him, but I'm just going to, ignore him. But he can't. He can't get over himself with regard to Mordecai, and this desire for final victory over him just consumes him. And this is going to become so important because he also doesn't know that Mordecai is Esther's cousin. So he doesn't know that they're related. He doesn't know that Esther's a Jew either. So these things are being tied together that we're starting to see that Haman doesn't know yet. So that's that third person omniscient, not omniscient like God is omniscient, but books and stuff do this sometimes. They put us in the perspective where we understand a bigger picture than the people in the story understand at the time. But let's read verses 10 through 14, what Haman does. So Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory and riches and the number of his sons in every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which he had prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate." Then Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully to the king's banquet." And the advice pleased Haman so that he had the gallows made. And so the word for, interesting side note here, the word for gallows, and this is a 75-foot gallows. Biblically, we have to adjust our thinking, because when we hear gallows, we think of the American West. We grew up in Western culture, and nothing wrong with that, except the way we think of hanging or gallows is by rope. The word for gallows is tree. And the idea of this would be a hanging death by impalement, by dislocation. This is an ancient type of death that you can see it all over the ancient Near East, all over the Old Testament as well. Numbers 25, when the people rebel against the Lord and turn and with sexual immorality worship other gods and apostatize totally from Yahweh, and there's this plague. The Lord says to Moses that your goal now, you must hang all the leaders as the representatives to take on that wrath of God. It's also the kind of idea that's in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. The cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that this is a cursed death of leadership, that they died under the wrath of God. And this was not just in the Old Testament. Other cultures did this too. The Persians, the Babylonians, all the way back in Genesis, when Joseph interprets the dream of his two fellow inmates, he says one of you is going to be hanged. The idea of that is that you're going to be, hung up, dislocated, that you're going to be impaled. So a couple ideas come together with hanging. It's the idea of impalement, dislocation, being pierced. All these things come together. That's why you can see in like Psalm 22, it's talking about a hanging impalement death that would have been the God curse on royalty specifically. And David saying, "I'm experiencing suffering that feels like that." That feels like I'm God forsaken. I'm hung up on the horns of a bull. All my bones are pulled out of joint. That type of thing. Now that's not. That's the idea of the concept of hanging. I'm not saying all those messianic ideas are in here by any means. This is non-messianic. They did this too in Joshua 5 and Joshua 8. They were supposed to hang the kings of the land and then bury them the same day. So this, is all over the place. But just so we understand what this entails, because it helps us understand the biblical concept of hanging, or what this idea is meant of the idea of, it says tree or something, if you're reading it in the literal wording there of why it says that. So anyway, that helps us understand it a little bit. But back to the story itself, Haman comes out and says all this, talks about all his riches, his glory, his favor with the king, his supposed favor in his eyes with the queen. He has all these things, but it can't satisfy. He has all these sons. Now he has at least 10 sons who are in the royal court, because we read about them later. There's an ancient Targum, which was a rabbinic kind of commentary. It's not inspired, but there was some thought that he had more sons. Some of them said that he had like 200 sons. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but he says, okay, I have all these sons, this multitude, and he has this royal court. He has people coming to him, to friends and different things. He has all these things going for him, but he says, all this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. And he just cannot get over the fact that Mordecai, even after the decree to have the genocide against the Jews in Persia, he still has this animosity toward Mordecai individually, and so he can't stand it, and so he's going to have to do something about it. And so they suggest to him, well, just go ask the king, just have the king give you permission to kill this guy, and you can do it in a very public way. Build a gallows, build a tree 75 feet high, and get this guy hung on it. I mean, that's all you have to do. And so he's like, yeah, that's great. Okay, next morning, I'll go do that. So this is like a matter, this is where the time compresses, because we've seen other periods of Esther, it's spread out a little bit more than we'd normally think. This is like day by day. The day before, Mordecai was learning about the decree and telling Esther. The next day, she comes and talks to the king in his throne room, and then has the banquet with Haman. That day, Haman goes home and passes Mordecai the Jew along the way, and then goes home and is talking with him. They're like, well, can't you just tomorrow, just go in the morning, talk to the king, and request this? And he's like, you're right. Why am I letting myself be bothered about this? I can eliminate this one singular problem out of my life and execute Mordecai, put him to shame, which is another key aspect of that type of hanging death. And so he's like, okay, this is a great idea. Haman is the perfect example of pride comes before the fall. Let me read some passages from Proverbs 16 that tie in really well with this section of Esther. So let me read Proverbs 16, 1 through 5, and I'll read some other verses along the way. But it says, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs motives. Commit or roll your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. Everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Assuredly, he will not go unpunished. So we see here the dual realities of human responsibility and God's divine sovereignty. And those are not competing things. And nor are they things, I think there are things about it that we don't understand, but it's not like they're equals either. God, the sovereign God, has created us to be responsible within his world. That's the way we should think about it, that the human responsibility happens within the context in the environment of the sovereignty of God. So that the plans of the heart belong to man. Haman thinks he's planning things. Mordecai thinks he's planning things. Esther is planning things. The king is planning things. We plan things. People against God plan things. The plans belong to man. We're making our plans, right? But the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. But it's the Lord who ultimately works it together and confirms or adjusts those plans. There's a guy from work who says, when we plan things, he's like, he's not a Christian, but he says, we plan and God laughs, right? And that's, it's not in the Bible, but it's true that the idea that our plans are going to be what is definitive is not the ultimate thing. It's important. It's good to plan. It can, there can be bad plans too. All these things, that's fine. We are thinking beings. We're beings with desires and wills and thoughts, tainted by sin, of course. But all those things are things that we are created to be and do. But understanding that is not a thing that's independent from the sovereignty of God. It happens within the sovereignty of God. That the sovereign God has made us these beings that are able to think and plan. All ways of man are clean in his own sight, but the Lord weighs motives. Meaning there's a motivation here. Haman's motivation is what it is. It is against Mordecai. It is against the Jews. It is against the Lord. But the Lord is still directing him, whether Mordecai would acknowledge it or not. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The word there is a roll. Roll your works to the Lord. And later, I'll read in 1633, it talks about the lots, like the throwing of dice. Roll your ways to the Lord. It's the Lord who will establish the plan. It's not saying don't plan. It's just saying commit it to the Lord and trust in the Lord. It just takes away some of the burden of the ultimate results, because that's really up to God, not up to us. And then verse 4 says, even the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil. And in the sense that there are no loose ends in God's plan. There are not aspects that he forgot or that are out of his control. Even the wicked are not out of God's sovereign control. Even those who are insist, who are not, they are not under the control of God, are under the control of God. God has a plan and a final result for everything. And then it's a warning against pride. That everyone who is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. He will not go unpunished. Haman represents as well. Proverbs 16:9. The mind of man plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. So we plan, but ultimately it's whether or not God directs. Proverbs 16:10, a divine decision is in the lips of the king. His mouth should not err in judgment. There's this working of God through even kings. And that this is not that kings are above the law, or that kings can do no wrong, but they're under authority. That they better wise up, as Psalm 2 talks about. That they better make decisions and not err in their judgment, because there's going to be an accountability for their judgment as God ultimately directs things toward his purposes. Verses 12 through 15, think about Ahasuerus, the king, here in Proverbs 16:12 through 15. It says, it is an abomination for the kings to commit wicked acts, for a throne is established on righteousness. Righteous lips are a delight of kings, and he who speaks right is loved. The fury of a king is like the messengers of death, but a wise man will appease it. In the light of the king's face, in the light of a king's face is life, and in his favor is like a cloud with spring rain. So it says the kings, there's no special immunity for kings, that it's an abomination for kings to commit wicked acts, that they don't have special rules for them and not for other people, that they're ultimately held accountable to the Lord as well. There's not autonomy. It's really God's rule, and whether or not we obey those things or not, whether we're kings or otherwise. This verse, Proverbs 60:18, very familiar, embodies Haman. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. Haman's about to fall. He's coming down. And as we're seeing, that he thinks that as he's setting everything up to go well for himself, he's really setting up his own destruction. And we're going to see that so clearly here. But the last verse of Proverbs 16:33, the lot, the dice, is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. That nothing's really left to chance, that this idea of leaving something to chance, or the aspects that we can't control or understand, is an aspect of trust in the Lord. And then remember, Purim is the word lots. Haman was casting lots to decide which day he was going to ask for this genocide against the Jews. But ultimately, the Feast of Lots is going to come out of this in favor of the Jews. It's as if God has flipped the dice over on Haman and the enemies of Israel, and has changed the outcome that looked like it was impossible to do anything about. So every human life is under the boundaries and direction of the eternal decree of God, that we make our decisions. God is so closely involved in the decision-making process of human minds that it's ultimately His will, whether we obey Him or not. Obviously, God calls people to obey Him. He calls people to love Him. He calls people to follow Him. But ultimately, those who do not are not outside of His sovereign control. He's guiding that process as well. We read a quote here from Bruce Waltke, the Old Testament theologian and writer, researcher. He says, "Human beings form, the Lord performs. They devise, and He verifies. They formulate, He validates. They propose, He disposes. They design what they will say and do. But the Lord decrees what will endure and form a part of His eternal purposes. To human beings gives the earthling the first word, but from the Lord gives God the last word." Let me read another brief quote here from Charles Bridges. It says, "What is chance to man is the appointment of God." What we see as chance, fortune, luck, all these things, is the appointment of God in an ultimate sense. Now notice verse 14 here. "In the morning, Haman has this plan to approach Ahasuerus at the next available opportunity and ask for permission to kill Mordecai." And it looks like he's going to be able to do this. Okay, Esther's delayed, asking the king for mercy. So he already has instigated this plan, but he cannot wait. He has to go for Mordecai individually. And then we see how the story unfolds further. Let's start in chapter 6. "During that night," so the same night, "during that night, the king could not sleep, so that he gave an order to the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king." Literally, what it says here is that the king's sleep fled. Normally, maybe he couldn't sleep a lot of times. Maybe he'd sleep through the night. But in the providence of God, the king is not able to sleep. Haman has this plan to come over early morning and ask the king to kill Mordecai. Had the king been sleeping, maybe that would have happened. But the king is up. And this, is a similar kind of concept to remember when Darius says that Daniel is going to be thrown into the lion's den, and he's up all night too, in Daniel 6:18. And he's unable to sleep. And it says no entertainment was brought to him. He didn't do anything. He couldn't focus on anything. All he could do was just sit there and wait. And so what does the king do because of his inability to sleep? And we see God even has sovereign purposes here in connection with ability or inability to sleep. Even some Psalms and Proverbs talk about this. They talk about situations in which the psalmist is kind of not able to sleep. And so he says, okay, well, this is kind of from the Lord too. And it's frustrating not to be able to sleep. And it's important to be able to sleep. All this stuff is true, but God has His sovereign purposes, he even works in that. So what does the king do? So what would you do if you couldn't sleep? Watch TV, read, lay there and look at the ceiling, count sheep or something. But what the king does is he gave an order to the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So he calls in some servants to read some light bedtime reading, government records. And so he wants to have read, go on and I'll, try to relax here. And so they're reading to him. Look at verse 2. It was found, written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were the doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So 5 years earlier, remember that Mordecai had warned, had told Esther, had let them know about this plot that was there to assassinate the king. And so he had, saved the king's life, in a sense. He had foiled this plot. These guys were executed. And notice again the use of the word eunuchs. You remember these guys come up, eunuchs, they die. Eunuchs are kind of, I figured out something I can compare it to. Eunuchs are kind of like in the story of Esther. Now, you don't want to go too far with this, but they're kind of like in Willy Wonka. Sister's not going to like this because she doesn't like that movie. They're kind of like the Oompa Loompas when something happens or something's about to happen and they come out and they sing like a little song about it. And then so it's kind of like that. That's how the author, now it's true, all this happened this way, but the author kind of points out that every time they come in, they're like, hey, and then something's going to happen. As we're going to see at the end of chapter 6. So now they come in, when the king can't sleep. This is a key moment in the story. It gives us that clue. And so they remind him as they're reading through the certain section of records from 5 years ago. Okay, do you have tax records or something from 5 years ago? They're reading the king, who happens to not be able to sleep, these records that happen to remind him that Mordecai has saved his life. Okay, so verse 3, the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Meaning, what did I do for him about this? What did I have done for him? And then the king's servant said, nothing has been done for him. So this is kind of like, you can almost feel a little bit of the awkwardness of the servants there saying, you didn't do anything. It's like you almost don't want to remind him. That's like, I guess nothing. You didn't do your job, or it's like now this on the king. He's a little bit embarrassed too because he's like, well, kind of dropped the ball on honoring someone who saved my life 5 years ago. This is going to be, have you ever thanked someone 5 years later for something they did 5 years ago? Sometimes that's appropriate. You go back to like a parent or a friend or a teacher or something like that. That's fine. But, sometimes it's a little awkward. Sometimes they've forgotten that even happened. They're like, I didn't even realize I did that. But, they're like, nothing. Okay, so this had happened back in Esther 2:23. This was a long time ago. So every little detail matters. Esther's waiting to make a request to invite the king and Haman to the banquet, inviting them to a second banquet the next night. Haman's feeling good. Then he sees Mordecai and he's angry at him. Then he gets advice from his family to kill Mordecai. He plans to go the next morning. It's providential. The king can't sleep. The king gets certain records read to him because he can't sleep. It happens to be the records from 5 years ago that talk about Mordecai saving his life. He remembers and asks, well, what did I do for him? He remembers that he did nothing. So, even from the past, God providentially worked in him not doing anything back then. And now, even the king's forgetfulness. All these details are lining up and working together. So, and then, who happens to walk into the palace at this time? Who may know the king's sleep habits, know he's, maybe an insomniac, or knows that, or maybe it's early in the morning by this time. Look at verses 4 and 5. The king said, okay, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. Then the king's servant said, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So now they say, okay, the king goes, okay, I need to talk to someone in the court. He needs some advice. Haman comes in either late at night or early in the morning. Maybe he knew that the king had trouble sleeping, and so he's like, okay, well, I'll go tonight, or maybe it's early in the morning, and he's like up and at him. He's up, early, ready to get in there and make his request. And so he comes in, and the king says, hey, Haman, we're glad you're here. The king wants to talk to you. And so he's brought in, and hey, I want to talk to the king too. And so he comes in at just the right time when the king's insomnia and doing his nighttime reading. And so look at verses 6 through 9. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, now this is like out of the blue a little bit, because the king, normally you go through this process of greeting everything. The king just asks a question directly. His mind is elsewhere, focused on this. And this is again where you see the third person omniscient a little bit, where it's like we know what the king knows and we know what Haman knows. And so, but there's a mismatch, and that's what kind of makes it funny. And so look, the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman said to himself, or said in his heart, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Then Haman said to the king, now Haman's going to describe what would be my ideal way for the king to honor me. This is Haman's total choice, will. He's trying to describe exactly what he wants. So Haman describes to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring the royal robe which the king has worn, and let the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head the royal crown has been placed, and let the robe and horse be handed over to the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. So Haman has just described this elaborate parade for what he thinks is going to be for himself. And now he's unwittingly spelled out and volunteered for doing this for his greatest enemy, Mordecai the Jew. I mean, he's making his decisions, he's planning out according to his own will, but it's not being worked out that way. God is turning the dice. God is overruling this. And God's not mentioned on purpose. So that you see, it's God working through these specific circumstances. They're even funny because we see how it's happening in retrospect. And so we see this overruling providence of God. Look at verses 10 and 11. This is kind of the shock here to Haman. It says, then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. It's like, imagine, and we shouldn't think this way about people, but imagine if you had someone that you just hated, and you thought you were describing something, you're like, hey, what do you want me to do for your birthday or something? And you're like, you lay out everything. It's like, okay, I appreciate that you seem to have really, thought through this. Okay, and I want you to go do that for that, individual. And so Haman, this is his worst nightmare. He is just spelled out, and at work we call this being voluntold. When it's like kind of voluntary, but you get a feeling that you should do it. And now he said, okay. The king says, okay, great. And then he says, go do this for Mordecai the Jew, who's sitting in the king's gate, and do not fall short in anything you said. Meaning, don't skimp on any of the details. I want you to make sure you've done this completely. So Haman, now notice Haman individually has to do this. Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai. So he's having to get Mordecai dressed in these royal robes. The day before, Mordecai had been dressed in sackcloth and ashes, mourning over and praying for and trying to deal with the situation of this coming pogrom, this ethnic cleansing of the Jews. And now he's being dressed by his enemy in these royal robes. Haman's actually helping him put on this clothing of royalty. And so he's helping him get dressed, took the royal robe, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done, according to done to the man whom the king desires to honor." So now Haman has to lead the parade for Mordecai and let everybody know that Mordecai, the Jew, is being honored by the king. Now this is kind of weird too, because you remember the king has allowed a decree to go out in his name that the Jews are going to be executed soon. They're going to be killed in Persia soon. So he's honoring Mordecai the Jew. But the king's kind of a drinker. He's not, he makes his best decisions at certain times. So, he wasn't real intimately connected with the decision that Haman had asked for about the Jews. He's just like, okay, yeah, you can have my ring, foolishly given that power over to Haman, do whatever he wanted. But now Haman had planned to hang Mordecai this day. Remember, his plan is, I'm coming in to get permission to kill this guy. The king instead makes him lead Mordecai through the streets, talking about how great he is in royal robes. I mean, imagine how humiliating this must have been. The NIV Bible commentary notes this, says, "One wonders what brought the greatest enjoyment to Mordecai." So we've been seeing this from Haman's perspective, but think about Mordecai for a second. His being remembered by the king, the people's adulation, or Haman's humiliation? He's like, well, why not all of it? You've seen that taco shell commercial that has the flat bottom, the little girl in it. He's like, they're fighting over having two different things, and she's just like, why not both? It's kind of like, well, Mordecai was probably happy about all of that stuff. But it's just, the irony here is so funny. It's like so palpable how Haman has laid out a plan exactly for himself, and God has turned it around so that Haman himself has to do this for Mordecai the Jew, his greatest enemy, and honor him in front of everyone. Haman did not expect his day to go this way. And he still has a banquet to go to. I mean, this is all happening in a shorter amount of time. He expected to kill Mordecai, go to the banquet. Now he is totally mortified, embarrassed, and goes home. He may have even forgotten about the banquet or been like, okay, I'm done after this type of day that I've had. Look at verses 12 and 13. We're almost through here. We'll quit here in a minute. It says, "Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered." I mean, this is an ancient Near Eastern way of showing like deep, deep shame. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and to all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin or of the seed of the Jews, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him." So she warns him. She goes, look, if this guy's a Jew, she doesn't have to be a prophet. She just needs to know the history and trajectory of how history has gone. She doesn't have to really know even the Old Testament in its detail. She just needs to know the God of Israel. And she recognizes, look, this is an unwinnable fight. Neither biblical prophecy, you can look at Exodus 17 talking about the Amalekites, or biblical history, 1 Samuel 15. Let me read Numbers 24:7. It says, "Waters will flow from his bucket," speaking of Israel, but personified as a he. Okay, so this is somewhat trajecting forward to the Messiah. "And his seed will be by many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag." Remember, Haman is an Agagite. "And his kingdom shall be exalted." Numbers 24:20. Amalek and Agag, same people group. Agag's the individual. "Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end shall be destruction." Okay? So Haman's downfall is beginning to complete the job that Saul failed to do all the way back in 1 Samuel 15, to eliminate the Agagites, and God's working that together. So why is this the case? Why is this ultimately happening? And it's because of that ancient declaration, Genesis 3, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. That we're seeing this worked out. That it literally says, it says in NAS that it's of Jewish origin, but it has the note that says, "If Mordecai is from the seed of the Jews, you will not overcome him." that history, as one author put it, has a pro-Jewish shape. That even Haman's wife recognized that trajectory. Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you, to the serpent, and the woman, which is feminine, and between your seed, plural, to the serpent, and her seed, feminine, plural. And he, masculine singular, meaning this is an individual that's representing the seed. And he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him, masculine singular, on the heel. That there's been this is the declaration from the beginning of how history will go with the ultimate victory of God and his ruling over creation, that it was as it was declared in Genesis 1 and 2. And this is how God's going to work it all out. So there's this seed promise that becomes embodied in the nation of Israel, and they take on those promises, but ultimately comes down to the Lord Jesus as the fulfillment of that seed. But even Zeresh, even Haman's wife, who had told him otherwise, I don't know if she didn't know he was a Jew before, but she's like, look, this is an unwinnable fight. If he's of the seed of the Jews, and you've already begun to fall before him, it's not going to go well for him. You're surely going to fall. And this is from his own wise men, wife, advisors. It's not from his enemies. And so, as Haman plans honor for himself, he unwittingly plans honor for his enemy in God's economy. And as Haman plans destruction for his enemy, he unwittingly plans destruction for himself. And so we see Haman's totally working according to his will and desires, but his will and desires are being ultimately overruled and directed by God. Haman is the instrument to honor Mordecai, and he's the instrument to destroy himself. Proverbs 26:27, he who digs a pit will fall in it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. There's lots of ways God can judge sinners in his wrath, but this is one of those ways that God uses means, just like in a positive way, uses means in things in people's lives, but he directs these things as well. Last verse, okay, verse 14. Remember what I said about the eunuchs being kind of like the Oompa Loompas coming in when something bad happens, right? Verse 14. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So again, he's totally humiliated, but maybe this is a good thing in his eyes. We know it's not, because we know not only is Esther a Jew, but she's the cousin of Mordecai. So we've just seen how Haman's end is basically setting up before it even happens. So man's will is within the sovereignty of God. We finish here with a quick quote. It says, God rules over history, and he will exalt his people and destroy his enemies. Simple as that. Let's close in a word of prayer and go to worship together. Oh God, we thank you for just being able to see you in the details, even when you are hidden, to see your work, that you can work all things together for good for those who love you and are called according to your purposes, that your purposes and plan will not fail, that even those who are decided enemies of you, that even their actions and desires and thoughts can be directed toward accomplishing your sovereign will. So Lord, we want to bow before you as the sovereign. We want to worship you. We want to obey you and obey Jesus Christ as our Lord. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.